Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, we are going to be wrapping up this month of ink, stamps, and stencils by me demonstrating a few more techniques. I've demonstrated at least 20 different effects and techniques this month, and I'm going to wrap up by showing you a few more techniques and also putting them together in these fun cards. So if you want to see how we do it, stay tuned and let's get started. So for my first project, I'm going to do a shadow effect. So this is the original card. Nobody sent me any suggestions of cards to make, so that's fine. I have plenty that have the new topics that I haven't covered yet. So that might just take up all of our time. So it might just work out fine. Otherwise, if we have some time left over, I might just show you guys and let you guys pick something that you want me to put together. So this is basically the shadow stamp. And what this does is you can see this dark part of the leaf. That's the shadow part. And then you get this lighter highlight. I don't know if you guys can see that very clearly but there's a little light side to the plant and then this dark shadow side. So it gives a nice dimensional effect and it's very easy to do. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how I did that. I don't know the name of this stamp, and any stamp will work as long as I do think you need to have more like these silhouette dies that are filled in a lot. I mean, I think it can work with real detailed, but it might not show up as much just because you don't have that solid leaf. So I think something that's more like a silhouette or has a lot of filling in works the best for that. But play around. So this is the stamp that I'm going to use. And I'm just using a gray, light gray cardstock. Now, it does work best on colored cardstock. If you have completely white cardstock, that white isn't going to show up. So you do need to have somewhat of a color. You don't want it too dark because then the dark's not going to show up. So you want maybe a medium toned, fairly neutral cardstock that's going to show the colors, the color and the shadow, the light and the shadow. And so that's why I've chosen sort of a medium gray. And then for the background, this is just a piece of craft paper. Now I have one of those rotary cutters, and it has a blade that does this specialty cut on it. And that's how I got that. But you can also use those funky scissors if you want, or you can tear it, or you can just cut it straight. It doesn't have to be fancy like that, but I just pre-cut it so I wouldn't have to do that while you guys were watching. All right, so I'm going to use my Misty tool because that's pretty handy, especially for this, because I do have to do multiple stamps. And this one is the cling stamp. It's the rubber stamp, so it's a little bit thicker. And when I use the thicker one and it has its own cushion, I don't need to use this foam part. So I'm going to pull the foam part out. And I'm just going to put this cardstock in there. I'm going to lay this approximately where I want it. Now I'm going to be tearing this down, trimming it so it doesn't have to be exactly, anywhere specifically, but I want it kind of centered just so I have room to tear around it. All right, and then I'm going to push the door closed. That's going to stick to my cling stamp. I did actually buy this kit. It goes with the Misty, and I think it's really helpful. I was using some other tools that weren't working great. This does have magnets, and it allows me to put pieces of paper in the center in case I have an overlapping stamp. And I'll show that, demonstrate that some other time. But right now I'm just going to use it as a magnet because I don't have, my other magnets were not very strong. And I did order the stronger magnet too, because I do think that some of these stick and it really can mess up your, your design. But it also comes with a little L-shaped and a little triangle. And I'll show you how to use those at other times as I use them. I'm not going to go through the whole explanation of them, but they're handy tools. Okay, so now I have it where I want it. And I'm going to start with a white pigment ink. For this one, I'm going to use the Stampin' Up! Whisper White. And the Misty tool, you can do this without the Misty tool, but it's just a little trickier. This does make it a lot easier. And then it's in that corner, and I'm just going to stamp it down. And there are other positioning tools out there. You don't have to use the Misty. And it's not real white in some areas, so I'm going to go ahead and just do it again. And that's one of the great things about this, is that it holds it right where it was. So if you don't like your first stamp, you can always add more. And I want to have a good amount because I want that white to show up. And I'm just going to do one more for good measure. I don't want to get any of that white ink into my other ink pad. So I'm also going to clean this off real good. And the next ink that you're going to use, you want to use a dye ink, not a pigment ink. Because the pigment ink's just going to sit right on top, and the dye ink likes to soak into the paper, and that's part of what gives this effect. Is when the dye ink goes into the paper, it makes it dark, which is why dye ink isn't always great on colored paper. But for this effect, it actually works pretty well because it does have that feature. Okay, I'm going to just take this over and heat set it to make sure that that's dry before I put my next layer on. I'll be right back. What I want to do is I'm going to shift this over just a tiny bit. So it was in that corner. Now I'm just shifting it just ever so slightly. And that's where we get that shadow. Now I can also shift it not only over, but up a little bit. So if I shift it up and over just slightly, the more I shift it, the more that shadow effect I'm going to see. Now I'm taking the Stampin' Up! Bold Olive. Now this is water-based dye ink. Only the white one in my collection is the pigment ink. Wherever it hits the paper directly, it absorbs into the paper and creates a darker color. And wherever it lands on top of that pigment ink's gonna basically allow that color to show. So that's where the green is, the light green. And then there'll be that white areas where the pigment ink is by itself. And it just gives you a really cool three-dimensional effect. Isn't that fun? So it's just an easy way to get a nice dimensional look. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and just put that aside to let it dry while I clean up. So what I'm going to do while that's still drying, and I can heat set it too, but I have some other things that I can work on. So one of the things you'll notice is I did a little bit of some staining along the edge, some distressing, and I'm going to use distress ink because that's really, and it's exactly what it's designed for. And I'm also, in this case, even though I showed that I really like the brush, this is a good example of when these little daubers, I think, work better because you have a little bit more control. So the brush works great for bigger areas, but I think for these little details, for edging and things like that, these little finger daubers are great. I don't want to get it everywhere, and I don't have as much control over where it goes when I'm using the brush. I can't just get the edge. And this just adds a little bit of dimension from this paper to the paper below. It acts almost like a little, like a matting. And that's going to go right on top of that one. I usually like to put my paper on the matting before I put it on there. I'm going to go ahead and just dry this off camera. I'll be right back because I want to make sure I don't mess it up. What areas? Okay, so I'm going to carefully just tear along the edges. Now, what I could do to make it a little bit easy to tear is I can take one of those, you know, watercolor brush. So I'm just going to basically draw a line of where I kind of want it to tear. And I'm tearing from the top because I want the fibers of the paper to show. If you can tell what I mean, let me just zoom in a little bit. So see how there's the rough side of the fiber of the paper that's showing on top. From the bottom, I'm not seeing that. See how you're seeing the clean edge? So it depends on what you want, because this picks up a lot of pigment, this rough open area of the paper. I like that to be on top. So I'm tearing it while it's up this way, and that's going to give me that torn paper on this side of the page. Now, using my dauber, I want a little bit, if you look at the original one, I have a little bit of some color along the edges, making this a little bit brighter in the middle, and then I have a lot of color along the very edges. Now I'm going to take my advanced tape glider, my giant, my giant glue gun, not glue gun, but tape adhesive tape runner. I don't know if you ever use this, but you just push the trigger to release the roller, and then it puts adhesive down, and then you release to stop rolling, and then it breaks off the tape. So it works pretty handy, and it lasts for quite a while because it's big. All right, so I'm going to put that up near the top because I want space for my sentiment below. And I'm going to use this vintage photo. Do my best. Okay, it worked out okay. That's when it would be nice to have it on the Misty, because then I could restamp it. It's not as dark, you know, like if I had it on the Misty, if this was a clean stamp, I could do it on the Misty, and I would maybe do one more round, but it's okay. It's subtle, but it's okay. All right, and then I can just take this whole thing and glue it onto the card base. The next one I want to show you is the silhouette stamping. And I know I've done this in previous card making workshops, but I also wanted to add some tips that I may not have shared before. I don't remember if I had or not. Again, I've gotten a lot of my stamps a long time ago, so I don't always have the packaging for them because I take them out and put in these little folders. So I apologize. A lot of them probably are not available anymore, but any of these silhouette stamps. Now, how do you define a silhouette stamp? A silhouette stamp is anything that basically is going to show up as a solid figure. So all of these are silhouette stamps. There's no openness between, it's not an outline stamp. Like, for example, this is an outline stamp. So all of that's open. You can color in it, but you can't really color in any of these. So those are really designed to be more like a silhouette, which is what we see here. I have my pre-cut matting and card base. And I'm going to use to basically as a to mat off this oval You can do a number of things. So if you have a punch or a die cut, you could cut it out of paper and then tape that down. Or since I'm not doing any of the die cut stuff, I just thought I'm going to want to use something that I can, that's part of what we're learning this month. So I thought we could use a stencil. So you basically just put your stencil where you want it. And this doesn't have even lines to really line up. So you just have to basically eyeball. You could make some markings there. I'm just following this edge and trying to see, let me zoom you in. So I'm just looking at my edge here and I'm checking the distance side to side and I'm moving it over a little bit and then seeing that this edge is still even until I get the same width across. So that's how I'm doing it. And then I'm going to take some tape. You can use either office tape or this is paper tape. It's supposed to be pretty gentle, something that's very low tack. And I'm just going to tape it down so that it doesn't move on me when I'm working with it. Now, the other thing I want to be careful about is if there are areas like this that's open to my cardstock, I need to make sure that that's covered. All right, and for my colors, I'm doing a similar, this might even be the same colors that I used. I think it is. Basically like a little sunset shades. So I have my yellow, my lightest, my medium, which is Melon Mambo. So my yellow is Daffodil Delight, Melon Mambo, and Rich Razzleberry. These are the Stampin' Up. And again, I got these quite a while ago, so I don't know if they carry these colors anymore. I can't guarantee, but I need basically yellow, pink, and kind of a warm purple should work. I'm gonna, for this project, I am gonna use my brushes because I do think they give me nice coverage for this type of blending as compared to the daubers. And I'm going to start with my lightest shade. So I'm going to start off project and then just rolling back and forth. I rotate one direction, then the other direction, just because I think it gives better coverage, especially along the edge. And I'm going to overlap where the yellow was because I want it to blend and create another color of those two together. So it's going to create like a tangerine in between. But now I have my background color. And while this is still on here, I'm going to do my silhouette stamp because you'll notice that my stamp that I'm using is longer than the project that I'm doing. So I'm going to need to still mask off because otherwise it's going to be kind of hard to figure out where that's going to be. But I am going to put this foam underneath to give myself a little bit of a cushion because I have to get through the depth of the stencil. So I want to make sure I have enough cushion under there to allow that to happen. So I'm going to put this on top of there. So that'll help because these don't have the foam anywhere. And this is a great project for the clear stamp because you can see through the project so you know where you're putting it. I want to make sure I get it nice and juicy because I'm not going to get a chance to really stamp again like I could with the Misty. I mean, if I had the Stamp-A-Majig, I could do that, but I don't want to set up my, my makeshift one is not that quick to use. So, all right. So I'm just going to basically see where I want this to be. And Now, I also want to add a butterfly, just like I did before. But instead of using the butterfly that came with the silhouette stamp set, what if I wanted to use this butterfly, but I really don't want that writing on there? Well, there's a couple things I could do. I've showed you how you can use the back of the stamp, right? So I could just use that. Really acts kind of like a silhouette, but it doesn't really have a lot of detail. So I want a little more detail. Like I really want it to have this detail, but I don't want it to have those words. So I'll show you what you can do. And this is true if I wanted to make anything into, I can pretty much turn anything into a silhouette stamp. If I wanted this to be a silhouette, I can turn it into a silhouette. So that's what I'm going to do, show you right now. Actually, before I stamp with that, but I want my butterfly, just like this one, I want the butterfly to come out of the frame. So that's why I took that all off right now. I'm just going to make sure. I think I might have touched it with my hand. So I'm going to put the butterfly right over here. Now you'll notice it still has words on it. But if I take my handy dandy magic marker, so this is the microns, these are waterproof markers. And you want something that's going to approximate the ink that you're using, and I think this will work fine. You could try a Sharpie, depending on what ink you're using, but just do a test. Now I have a silhouette made from a regular stamp. Now, in certain angles, that's kind of disappearing. You can kind of see that there were some words there maybe, but not really. It has a little bit of texture, but and also another thing you can do is if, for example, if let's say something didn't turn out okay, like when you did the stamp, you could fill it in. Like at the very bottom, it doesn't go all the way to the edge, so I can just basically bring this down to the edge if I want. So you can always use these markers to fill in. Now I think I will trim this off. If you get, when you do cutting or whatever, if you get these little burrs of paper, see how there's this little bit of a, sometimes if your cutter's getting dull or something like that, you can have that happen. It can also happen with die cutting, but you can just take a little sanding block, or you can even use nail file, any sandpaper, just you can smooth off the edges and get rid of any of those little burrs. Now I'm going to move this stuff close to the top. I still want to have a little bit of separation, but I want enough room for a sentiment below. Okay, gotta be really careful not to rock and roll, and I'm going to try to look straight on top of my project so I can try to center it. And this is why it's so nice to have the clear stamps and the Misty and all of those, because it's a lot harder with these guys. And I'm just trying to be careful not to wobble at all. It's not great. It's a little bit lighter on this side. And that's again why it's nice to be able to reset, but I just didn't want to set up my stamping positioning tool. Normally, if I was making a bunch of these, I probably would do that. Just because then I'd see I could restamp that right on top of it. Trying to do that without a tool is just near impossible. So the other thing I can do if something like that happens and I really want it to be darker, or I should say lighter, more distinct, I can always go. I can also try to use a white gel pen. If you think you have a steady enough hand, you know, you can always, I don't, but I can always try to fill in. Worst case scenario, if you don't like how it turns out, is you can always take a piece of paper and put something over it. So that's always an option. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like that. You get the point. And then I'm going to put this on top of this. Now, what'll happen sometimes is I'll get to this part and I'll go pushing it down and then I have ink on my hands and I put ink on my project or do something. So just, you know, sometimes that's when it is nice to have like a baby wipe or something, or a clean rag that you can wipe your hands off so you don't do something, you know, to your project when you're at the final stages. But so there's the silhouette. So this is the selective, I think I put it as a selective color technique. I want to make sure I'm using the same word that I used in my guide. Selective color. Yeah. So if you think about black and white photos, sometimes they'll make the lips red or the cheeks rosy or the eyes blue or something like that. And then they leave the rest of it black and white. And that's the concept here. And you can do it a lot of different ways. You could rotate and make it more of a collage of your image, or you can do like what I did. And it's sort of like, oh, you're standing out in this crowd of, you know, black and white. And so that's basically the concept there. And this, it really, really, really does help to have a stamp positioning tool. This is probably one of the projects that is even more important than anything I have been shown so far. So I can take my project. Let's see, I'm going to turn this way so that I have more space to move it. Because basically what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to line this up. I'm just going to mark it with my 2 point. And so I know that I have it at the 2. I'm going to hold it there. Now I'm going to put this somewhere. I want this in the middle. So I'm at the 2. I know that it's 5 inches wide, even though according to these lines, it's slightly off. These lines aren't perfect, I think. But basically I want to go 2.5 inches. So that's the center point. So I'm just eyeballing it. I want space below for my sentiment. So I'm bringing it up. And I'm looking at the space on either side of it to see if that looks pretty centered. So, I mean, that's how I roll. I don't need everything to be perfectly aligned. I want this as close as possible, and you could get more precise if you want to, but I'm just gonna eyeball it basically and use my guidelines. Okay. So now I've got the center one where I want it. Now this ink is usually really good at the first time around giving a nice, crisp and clean look. Typically this is that oil-based permanent, so it's really handy. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to move it far enough so that I have space for the next one. And I'm not exactly sure how far I'm going to need to move it because I don't know exactly how big that is, but I can kind of eyeball it. I'm going to go 1 inch over and just see if that's far enough. And it's not. It looks like it's overlapping. There's a little bit of space here between the edge and the cone, but I want to be sure that I'm not overlapping it for this particular project. So I'm just going to try 1 1/4 movement, and that clears, that's going to clear it just fine. So I'm going to stop there. And so I moved it from the 2 to 1 1 1/4. I want to exact, so that's easier for me to keep doing that. Now I can just, and now I know that it's going to be in a straight line because all I did was move the paper over. Now I'm going to move it again. Now I'm running out of runway over here to do my measurements, but I can look over here and kind of get an idea of how far I need to move over. I'm going to have to stand up to see what's going on over there. Okay, so I'm at 6, I'm at 5 3/4 basically. So I'm moving to 4 3/4 is 1 inch, and then another 1/4 of an inch. Because what I want to do is I want to stamp it right there. Now, you'll notice that there's nothing underneath. So if I stamp it there, it's going to get the stamp pad dirty. So I'm just taking a piece of scratch paper and just putting it under, just so I don't have to clean that off my stamp pad before I do anything else. Nope, and it did not give me a nice, oh yeah, it did. It's just wet from that angle. Okay, never mind. I thought it looked like it was gray, but I think it was just wet. Okay, so now I'm going back to my original 2. That's the center point. And now I'm moving the other way 1 1/4 inches. There is a bigger version of the Misty that I don't have that would allow you to move it without, running into things, but imagine how much time it would take to try to line those up if you didn't have this. It would be quite the task. So isn't that cool? Now I could just make these all random and then just have one color, and that would be fun too. So there's lots of different variations of this concept, but I kind of liked this little, ducks in a row kind of look. Now, one of the things that I recently discovered, for a long time I've been using this permanent waterproof ink for projects that I've used my Copics, but oftentimes I'll do a heat emboss over it first. And you can use it with the alcohol markers. However, this is oil-based, and oil is a solvent. Alcohol is a solvent for oil. So if you work the alcohol onto the black ink, it's going to potentially smudge or smear that. So you can either just be really careful. In this case, I can't really be careful because I have to go right over those little marks. So, and I did it like a test. I thought, I've been using this, but I really, like I said, I think I always did some heat embossing in the past. So I tried it, and it definitely did do some smearing. So just be careful. If you don't mind a little bit of the ink smearing, you can use it. But I would recommend the Memento Tuxedo Black, which is water-based, and water, of course, doesn't get diluted by the alcohol. So that works fine. But I'm going to use the alcohol. I'm going to go ahead and just do a little bit of heat setting just to see if that can help it keep it from smudging more. And I organize my Copic markers by color families. I do little trios usually of color together. light, medium, and dark. And then I'm gonna let that dry for a minute before I do this, but I drew in some little sprinkles in the top just with the fine liner. And this is just a water-based fine liner. And then I did my white gel pen over that. And I want to make sure that that's dry before it dry. Alcohol dries very, very quickly, so it shouldn't take too long at all. Actually, I think before I glue that on, I think I'm going to put my little strip, because if this is longer, it's not. But so if this strip was a little bit longer than my piece, I already cut it down, then I could just trim it off the edge. But if I had this glued on here, I would have to make sure it's trimmed before. So it's just a little easier to do this first. Now that should be dry enough. I can just add my little sprinkles, and I'm just doing little lines going different directions. And for the final, for the sentiment, and make sure that it's in the right orientation. I've done that before where I had the sentiment upside down, and that's not fun, especially at this stage of the game. However, if I mess up the sentiment, I can just put something over it. Like I can just cut it. I could just put it on another piece of paper and then just stick it on there, because that's what I've had to do. In fact, the that balloon card that I did with the bouquet of balloons, the reason I ended up putting that embossing label maker on is because I tried handwriting it. I thought it'd be whimsical, and then I remembered, oh yeah, my penmanship leaves a bit to be desired. It did not look good. It would be really cute if it was your child that made it, but it was not cute for me. All right. I do love how clean and crisp that archival ink stamps. It just doesn't work great with the alcohol ink for coloring, but that's okay. So that's the Select Color. Hi, just a reminder to please hit that like or subscribe button, and don't forget to share or comment to help support this channel if you find this content helpful. All right, let's keep going. Hello everyone, I'm gonna do a little bit of a reset. The project that I was trying to do in my workshop didn't work out great. I ended up creating this, but what I was trying to do wasn't working. I was trying to use masking technique and be able to get my 3 scoops, but it became a little bit troublesome, and I'll explain why in a second. But this was the original project, and I'm going to show you 2 different ways to mask 4 different effects, and I think I'll just do 2 scoops because the 3rd scoop was a little bit more challenging. So basically I'll be using this stamp. I'm also going to use the
this stamp from this set, and it's probably retired, but they might be floating around out there, but I'm sure you could find any ice cream cone stamp. But this is the Honeycomb Happiness by Stampin' Up. And the idea of this is to do masking so you can do layering. Step one is you need to create a mask. And this is true for any of the masking techniques, obviously. So I'm going to make a couple masks. I actually have 2 layers. This is Post-it and it's sticky all the way around. So I'm going to stamp it on here and cut it together so that I have a couple layers of masks. And I'm going to be using the Memento Tuxedo Black. This is a fade resistant dye ink, and it's resistant to the alcohol markers, which I use to color. So I switched that as well. I didn't have any of this when I first did this project, but I think that's the best way to go. And then I have my card base. I'm going to use a craft card base this time. Actually, I did use it on, I used a masking that was craft on that one, but I'm going to use a pink mask, and I've already cut these to size. And then this is my design, 3 3/4 by 5, and then this one is 4 by 5 1/4, and then the base is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I like the thinner paper because when you're trying to mask, if you use cardstock, it could actually, the thickness of it could keep the stamp from stamping down onto the paper where you want it on the edges. So it is nice to have the thinner paper. Okay, so this will be my full mask, and then this will be my partial mask. So I have the cone and I have the ice cream separate, and then I have the full one. I want to clean this off because I have some ink on it, and I don't want to get any ink on the paper as I'm positioning it. And the reason I do that is because when I'm trying to figure out where I want it on this page, I'm going to have to set it down on there, and I just don't want to get ink. And then I want to just put this where the bottom of where I want my cone. So I want room for the sentiment, and I'm just going to do the double scoop. So okay, so now I can pick that up on the MISTI. So the first thing that I can do is I want to stamp it, but when I stamp the first one, I want to make sure that I'm not putting the arc over the top, right? Because that's going to show up on my next layer if I leave that there. So what I decided was easy to do is to just use the mask of the ice cream and put this ink on using that mask to keep the ink from getting where I don't want it. So I'm basically going to imagine that this is, there's another scoop on there, and then I can ink it. It's going to keep the ink from getting up here on the top. You could always just remove that ink if you know exactly where you don't want it. Okay, so now I can go ahead and put that one down. Looks good. Now for my second stamp, I'm going to adjust this down. And if you see how far down the different scoops are, it's not that far. It's about, let's say about two of these squares maybe. And then I'm going to put this there to keep it from stamping below where I don't want it. And now I can put ink all over the whole thing because I'm putting the mask over here. And now I have the second scoop. Now the difference in how this looks versus this, and it takes a, you know, it takes a different different work in order to make that happen. I could have just masked this off, but the problem is just getting it in the exactly right spot. So you can do that if you want it to make the ice cream all the way across. But to me, it's easy enough to either color those shades in, or I could even go in with my marker and just fill that in. Now this isn't the best marker because this is alcohol based and that'll be messed up with the alcohol markers, but so I can just draw it in. I would use probably not a Sharpie, my micron pen marker to do that. The reason you can't do the third scoop is because I would have to also mask off the top part. So you can do that. If I were to mask this off and then I also masked off this when I did the stamping, that would work. But to me, that's just too much work. It's too much masking. You could do both, and then you would get kind of the middle. You would get the middle piece, and then you could add the third piece. All right. This also works for saying that this ice cream cone is behind. Now, how I would do that, now I'm going to make it look like, instead of stacking on the same ice cream, I'm going to say that I have a row of ice cream cones. And this will work for bouquets of flowers or balloons or anything like that, where you have multiple things and you have some things that are behind other elements. So that's what this particular technique is about. I just, of course, had to make it more complicated. So normally you would just stamp the first image that you want. Make sure you have room to move the paper. And then you would move it however far down you want. Let's say we want each of them at, you know, pretty close intervals. I would use this mask for this. And now I stamp the whole thing because I'm not worried about it because I've got it masked. Because it's behind it. And then I could go in and mask that one for the next layer. And I could keep doing that. So now I'm going to move it down another 2. And now I basically have several ice cream cones behind themselves, or behind the first one. And so you can do it, you can use the technique, and you can see now that I've done it this way, that doesn't look like it's ice cream on top, stacked on top, because you have this little, the top of each ice cream. So it shows that that's in front of that and that's in front of that. So you get kind of like this repeating echo. Now another way that you could do this that would make it look more like an echo effect, let's just show that too while we're at it. So I'm going to ink it up, and then I'm going to move this down too. And I'm going to put my mask on. And then I'm not going to re-ink this time because I want it to be like kind of a echo effect. And so I want it to not be as dark. And then I can do it again. And so you get this lighter and lighter kind of echo repeating effect. And I think that's a really fun way to do it. So you can see that's the full effect, and then this is kind of like a little echo effect. So that's some ways that you can use the masking. You can either mask your stamp to keep the ink where you want it, or you can mask the page and then you can make more out of your stamp than you maybe think you can. So I'm going to just finish one of these cards. All right, so there I have my 2 scoops, and I would probably just color like one of them, do selective color with that for these ones. I don't know that I would color all of them. I think just the first one. But then I'm going to attach that. And there you go. I do like the 3 scoops, and I can always cut another one out and color it and put it on top if I want to. So I might just do that in the end, but anyway, there you go. Let's get back to the rest of the program. I'm going to go ahead and move on to this one. I'm using some more Stampin' Up. I'm using the Garden Green, the Crushed Curry, and Night of Navy, my color schemes. And this is what I'm basically going for. And bokeh effect is basically when you take a photograph, but some of the particles are not in focus. There's light that's not in focus. And so you get these little orbs, basically. And it's a cool effect. Kind of, it could look like there's snow or something like that. That's why the winter scene, I think, is kind of a nice effect for it. Or it could just be lights in the background. Just depends on what your story is that you want to portray. Maybe mine is a little bit of rain. And I'm just going to start with the lightest color, the yellow. And I just want to put it in a few spots. Be careful not to go off this edge because it's open. In fact, I could, just to be safe, I could have just used these, to be honest. And I'm just going to put a little bit of yellow here and there. Just in a few spots. Then I'm going to go in with my green, which is my medium tone. And then I'm going in with my blue, which is my darkest.
I want it dark enough where the bokeh effect's going to show up. I don't want it to be super dark, but I do want it to be a little bolder than, you know, some of the other blending that I do. That way the white's going to show up a little bit better. Okay, now I want to put this, and I'm using this little pine stamp. Now this is Wonderland by Stampin' Up. And it's, I'm sure it's probably retired, so, but there are tons of different pines out there. And let's see, I don't need a lot of them. I just want this little corner. I am putting it partially on a block, not the whole thing, because I don't need the whole thing to be on there. But the block helps stabilize it so you don't push the edges in if you don't want to. So I'm just going to put those right in that corner. And then sometimes what will happen if you have it masked off is the edge will get, because of the space, it'll keep the stamp from getting right in that corner just because of whatever's masking. So you can do a couple things. I'm going to take my darkest color and just go in and kind of fill it in so that it's not noticeable. That's usually a good solution. You can also take that black marker, one of these black markers, and just color it in if that feels better. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and leave the mask on because I want to make sure I don't do my bokeh effect past my border. So I'm keeping those on there. And I have a few different white inks. I thought I would just try out each of them. So I'm going to use a stencil because I think the stencil gives me a little more control than on a little stamp. I have a great little circle stamp. You can use that too. But sometimes the circle stamps leave kind of like a stamp mark that's not quite as soft and organic as doing these guys. So I'm going to just use the little circles. I'm going to have a little Post-it handy to block off any open circles. Like if I'm trying to get close to this one, I can just block that off. And then I can use the dauber. I don't have a brush for my white, although I think that would work really well. But I just use a white dauber. And of course, I'm going to be using the same white dauber, so it'll probably, you know, be a mix of these different pigment inks. But I just was curious to see how they compare. And like I said, there's going to be a little bit of cross contamination, but still, I think you'll still be able to tell. Okay, so the first one I'm going to do, and I'm going to just kind of work my way down. This is the Color Box chalk. Now, back in the day, I think before they really got into a lot of the pigment inks, or even during the time that they came out, they had these chalk inks, and I don't know if these are basically just pigment or if there's something different about them. And I don't even think they have them anymore, but I'm going to try this. And I think I'm going to go off the edge over here. And I'm just dabbing it in. And I'm gonna stamp off because I want to see how the different ones behave. I'm just gonna try to get as much of that off. I mean, it's not gonna get everything off, but now I'm gonna try, this is the Versacolor Ultimate Pigment Ink White. Actually, you know what? Before I do that, I'm going to actually use this other color box. This is Pigment Stamp ink. So I want to compare this to the chalk and see if it looks any different. Maybe the chalk just has more chalk in it, and so it's a little bit more chalky looking compared, but you know, but pigment ink is pretty chalky looking already. So All right, so I'm going to just do this one over here because I want to, that's definitely, I don't know if it's just that it's a juicier stamp pad, but it's definitely more bright going on there. And I have to be careful because if I stick this on top of it while it's wet, it's going to smear that around. So I'm going to just move away from that area and do some smaller ones. Try not to overlap that. Okay, now I'm going to go to the Versacolor. This is Ultimate Pigment Ink 80 White. It looks kind of beige, but that just could be because I've probably contaminated it in the past. But it definitely looks more beige than compared to the other ones. And it's going on more beige too. Doesn't look quite as bright. And now I'm going to do my Stampin' Up. Oh yeah, that's real bright. The thing that will happen though with these is they will absorb a little bit of the color underneath, and so they'll change, they'll get darker rather than lighter, and they'll take on some of the pigment. So they have kind of some interesting behavior. All right, I'm going to go back to Color Box Frost White. I can also take a little Q-tip . I love the bokeh effect. It's really fun. You can do it with watercolor. You can do it with really just about any medium. That one really just faded out. But you can see, even though they're really dark when you put them, are really bright, I guess I should say really highly pigmented when you first put them on there, they really do soften up. Okay, let me just put one right there. And I don't know that any of them stand out as being that different. They all kind of look like they're showing up about the same. So that answers that question. We're not a clear winner or loser. This is not my favorite paper for any of these. I really don't think that my Nina Solar White cardstock is as bad as it's. I mean, that just took like the whole layer off there after all that work. But I can, like I said, I can trim. I mean, I can even trim that whole box out and just make that lifted on top of another card. But that's just unfortunate. You don't want to have that problem. So test your tape, test your paper. You can always put the paper on your skin or on your clothes the tape to loosen that adhesive up a little bit so you don't risk doing something like that. Now, I'm going to heat set that because that's pigment ink and it does stay a little bit more permanent when it's heat set, and it also takes a long time to dry anyway. So, so I'm going to for sure heat set that, and then I just need to add the sentiment and then put it on its mounts. And then this one's a little bit smaller than the other one, but I'm not going to show you guys that because I've already showed it to you several times and we're already at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. So that's the bokeh technique. We did the silhouette technique. We did the selective color technique. And I showed you the masking technique, but we didn't really get a card out of that one yet. at least I didn't make one. So there's the masking technique for doing clusters of things. And then of course that was an interesting exercise, but it's worth experimenting different ways. And then of course we did I think this is the one that we did. And this is the one that we did tonight. So we did the shadow technique. And was that? Yeah, I think it was those 5. So basically, including this one that didn't really go as well as planned. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment to help support this channel. And as always, happy creating. Thank you. Bye.